Is it me you're looking for? I can see it in your.
I can
What's
see
that from?
it.
I
It's
can
Lionel
see it
Richie.
in you. Yeah, but it's been adopted for like trolls.
Oh, it's a Trolls thing?
Yeah, I was
Oh,
like, all my things are.
we're not there yet.
Yeah,
I'm not there yet.
all my things are kids' things.
It's respect, bro.
Yeah, yeah. It was like so funny. It was like lyric, right? She's like 5, and she hears some song that is from like it's from like the like originally like from the 70s, right? Not even that. I think it was Phoenix's friend was like blah 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 song is like, oh yeah, that's from like some dumb movie like Trolls or something, and I'm like, no, that song was made like from before you were born. I was like, it's not originally from Justin Timberlake.
Bro,
Didn't just originally create that for Trolls.
you're wrong, Dad. You're
Yeah,
wrong.
totally.
Ooh, this is a good opportunity to roast Jared since he's not here. My favorite Jared moment with that is I don't know where we were, but It's a Hard Knock Life came on. The
Oh, yeah.
song from Annie, the musical,
Not
not the
the not the
Jay-Z
Jay Z
one.
one.
And he was listening to it and he's like, did they sample this from Jay-Z? Like, how did this work? I was like, you've never seen Annie?
Yeah.
Come on, man. This is one of the classic musicals.
Classic adopted kid.
We're
Classic
back.
orphanage story.
We're back with more orphan stories.
Then what are we back with?
Starbucks Part 2.
Yeah.
Because we were talking about the whole Starbucks acquired podcast. The acquired podcast had Howard Schultz on.
Yeah.
He was essentially giving the Starbucks arc from day one to present day. And we talked about it last week. You'd listened to the episode. I hadn't listened to it yet. I have since listened to the entire episode. It's about 3 hours long. It's incredible.
Right, yeah. I mean, we talked about it as you've been listening to it, that there's such like a dichotomy in there, and I think that's kind of what I was trying to get to last week, and maybe I didn't quite say it so well. As like, some people have all these things that they say, but then you were talking about it as well as, but it's like there's a big difference between what people say and what they do,
right?
And that your actions speak louder than words,
right?
And that like that's what I was. It's like there's so many lessons that can be learned from listening to this podcast in that vein of like, you may meet a lot of people along your life who like say things, but it's really like what you do, and like for me, what I see other people do that matters to me more than what they say.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when I'm listening to, well, first of all, I had never heard him speak in any meaningful way. Like, I'd seen clips of him here and there, but I'd never listened to a Howard Schultz speech. And the dude's incredible. Like, he is a great speaker, great communicator, everything from, I don't know, there's something about the cadence, his voice, he's really calm
tells a
and
great story.
relaxed.
Like, some people just tell a great story.
Great storyteller,
right?
Number one storyteller. And it was almost like throughout the episode, my opinion of him was just kind of changing and evolving as more layers get peeled off. But after the first hour, I was like, wow, this dude's incredible. Also, a lot of the things that he talks about, like his vision and his culture, I could take chunks of those, remove them. I could read them at a Cat and Cloud meeting and they would fit right in.
Yeah, which
like directly.
Yeah, which again is like just a really interesting lesson in the like, what do you say, like the appeal of someone who can tell such a great story and who in their mind has these ideals, but then when it gets translated into action, like those ideas, like they don't get translated into action in the same way that he talks about them. And that's just where it's really dangerous, right? Because somebody's saying this stuff in this really alluring way over and over again, but how it's getting translated into the business is totally different. And what, like, the actions are what really matter for your team and for the culture of the for the actual culture of the company.
I feel like he is having a battle royale inside of his head consistently, like
right, yeah,
like from the get-go, because when he talks about going to Italy and seeing what he saw, and then coming back and talking to Jerry Baldwin and the people who owned Starbucks at the time and wanting to do this coffee bar concept, and they're just like, no, 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 no. And then they finally allowed him to do it with, inside of Starbucks under the Il Giornale name.
You get this corner.
Right. You get this corner of this space. And I actually do believe
that at that moment.
I believe, well, no, I think the two things are kind of coexisting the whole time. So I do think that he believes in that vision in terms of he is enchanted by this Italian coffee culture. He's enchanted by the idea of the third place, by the idea of connection, community, by the idea of the barista. And you can see that. I wish I would have been there, man. Like, it would have been so cool to go into one of the early, the first 11 Starbucks. Like, it would have been so cool because he was talking about the menu and, how there weren't really any modifiers. They didn't have the, it was short, tall, and grande. They didn't have the venti size, all the things that later on got layered on. So I think one part of him believes in this, but the story that's louder in his head seems to be about scale and this traditional quote unquote successful business model. Because he says in the podcast, he said it was very important for him even early on that the company went public. Yeah. Like he said that at some point, and
it's just all those ideas, and we'll talk about more and more, but all those ideals are in stark contrast to what you have to do as a business to scale and grow fast enough to be a public company. Right? And that then once you're a public company, you've chosen, right? And we've talked about this as well, like offline, like you've chosen this decision that reinforces that once you're a public company and you have to report earnings and answer to investors, that like you've chosen this path that continues to put in motion these same decisions that are going to prioritize scale and growth, which is kind of the opposite of this idea that he had in the beginning.
Right. So I have one of my favorite quotes of the whole thing. There's a bunch of great ones. We'll put a link to the episode. You should listen to it. It's just so interesting. If you're in the coffee industry, or just if you have your business, dude, I don't know. It's crazy. Okay.
Yeah.
So here's my favorite one. He says, scale and ubiquity creates complexity. Complexity demands efficiency, but we are in a business where that touch point between the customer and the barista has to be protected and has to be elevated. He says, Starbucks demands nurturance. It's a company that has to be nurtured like a young child. That is an anomaly, inconsistent with scale. So by his own admittance, he says that the core of what Starbucks stands for is inconsistent with scale.
And then what does he do?
He is continually scaled since day one. Totally. And it's crazy because it's not like they even started small. Like from the time he took them on, they had 11 stores from the gate, which as someone who is responsible for running 4 stores in a roastery, 11 stores is no joke. That's already a pretty big business.
Yeah, no joke.
That's probably 250, 300 employees, something like that.
Yeah.
Pretty sizable leadership. That's already big. So I think that it's just so interesting to me that these stories coexist. And the thing that makes this is why I think he's got this like battle royale going on in his head. Because at first, some of the things that he was talking about were a little off-putting. So there's this open letter that he wrote on LinkedIn that they reference at the end of the episode. And the open letter is essentially a reflection on how he feels Starbucks is missing the mark and essentially needs to return to these core values that he's describing about, workplace culture, experience, essentially.
Guest
experience, workplace culture, and craft seem to be like these core tenets, not too different than ours, surprisingly. And he writes this whole thing about how, leadership, like you really need to honor these things. And I'm just like, he set forward the path that they're on decades ago.
Yeah.
And what they're doing now isn't too different than what they've been doing the whole time. And it's almost...
They've just made it way more complex. They've just made it way more like less connective between the guest and the barista. Like they've just done all these things that are against.
But it feels to me like those are letters to himself. You know what I mean? He's writing them from a disconnected point of view, in that he's not CEO of the company. He's not on the board of the company. He's not affiliated in any official way, is what he says. And then he's writing these letters about returning to these core concepts when his whole story arc with the company is inconsistent with his view now. You know what I mean? So I'm just wondering how much is he talking to himself versus how much is he actually talking to the current leadership of Starbucks?
Just because he knows there's no way back.
There's no way back. And there's been no way back for a long time.
I mean, probably for the first like 3 or 4 years that he had the company.
So here's a micro story that shares the same traits as the macro story. This one's fun because it involves the Frappuccino.
Yeah.
Which, fun fact, I didn't know that Starbucks did not invent the Frappuccino. So part of the story is when they were expanding into the Boston market, they acquired the Coffee Connection, which was run by George Howell, which I also didn't know that George Howell had another life before I knew George Howell. Yeah. So I'm getting all these cool history lessons. George Howell has a chain of stores called the Coffee Connection. It was like, how many
22 stores.
Okay.
They did maybe it was the other way. Did they have I had it. They have like 16 stores. They do 22 million, and Starbucks bought the company for 22, well, for essentially 1 times.
Let's see. Is this 23 stores, 16 million a year in revenue?
Yeah.
And they bought it for a 1x revenue.
Or around 1.5, because they paid like 22 million.
Yep.
So they paid a little less than 1.5 times sales.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay, I have the transcript here.
Oh,
just
cool.
This thing's so interesting. I'm like searching for it in real time. So they bought the Coffee Connection to expand into the Boston market, and the Coffee Connection created and had the trademark for the Frappuccino beverage, which
is just wild.
That is mind-blowing enough to me, because I thought that was just, wow, okay, I had no idea. And then I'm scrolling through the transcript here. Okay. And then Howard says, when they bought the business, they inherited the trademark. So now Starbucks has a trademark for the Frappuccino. Howard Schultz says, I looked at that Frappuccino with disdain. I didn't like the name. I didn't like the beverage. I didn't think it was appropriate for Starbucks. I just saw Starbucks as such a purity with regard to coffee. And then in the very next sentence, he says, I was dead wrong. So in rapid succession, they acquire this thing that he doesn't like because it's not a pure coffee concept. They reformulate it in Southern California. It becomes a mainstay of the company. And then they bottle it to bring it to the mass market in a joint venture with Pepsi. So that's going back to what you're saying, to where it's like, despite this internal story that he's telling himself and others
about craft and connection,
the whole thing is clearly about scale.
Yeah.
Like, for sure.
Every decision he's making is a pro-scale, anti-culture, workplace culture, anti-guest experience.
What do you think helped them grow so much? And because it seemed like it took a long time for the brand's shine to start slowly wearing off. Like, he tells this really, like, the interesting story of You've Got Mail, when Starbucks had the feature, and You've Got Mail. It must have been the early 90s or something like that. Yeah. And at that time, it still seemed like carrying that white cup with the green logo on it down the street had some sort of cultural cachet.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Yeah. And now it doesn't at all. Yeah. It's
like
a commodity.
It's like carrying a McDonald's cup.
Right. It's not any different. Whereas there's companies that are smaller that are still large that seem culturally more relevant. Like in the place that we're at now, it's like Dunkin' Donuts. Dutch Brothers is definitely cooler than Starbucks,
which is interesting because they also they went public a year or two ago, and they also are growing now at a really fast
I'm sure
pace.
they're on a similar path, but they're definitely the favorites. They have a little more cultural cachet right now. So like I'm wondering why it took so long to wear off. Maybe there's just nobody else in the market like that at the time.
So they had first mover advantage for sure in the space, right? Like he talks a little bit about they could have any corner they wanted, right? There were no big brand cafes or restaurants that were locking down all the corner real estate, right? So you could just go into a market and grab all the corner real estate, right? So the first mover advantage for something that's real estate related like that is huge. And then I think it's just over time, despite what he tells himself, it's like they're just layering in complexity after complexity, right? They're just expanding the menu into all the, what they say, there's over like 1 billion different combinations of drinks that someone that works at Starbucks has to make. And the online ordering, which has just become like a huge shit show. Like they're just layering in. I think it's one of those like slow builds over time of just like layering in complexity after complexity that it's like boiling what do you say, like you boil the frog
in hot water, slow and steady,
and just like it's just I feel like over the last 5 to 10 years it's like they just realized they've killed it because of all the complexity that's just built up, like one pro scale, pro business decision at a time, and now you see like the result of all of that.
Do you think there is a chance that a brand like that can ever roll it back?
Like maybe if you had someone who cared so much that they could like take the company private. Right, because you're gonna get crushed. Like if you're gonna do away with mobile ordering, right? They also talk about like if Starbucks was a bank, so because of like the app and the online ordering and loading in the gift cards and everything they do on that side, it's like that Starbucks at any point in time has like $1.8 billion of cash on their apps that they're essentially like floated, kind of similar to like an insurance company, right? Where you're paying premiums all the time, but that insurance company can use that money to make money like in the interim.
Right, because the premiums outweigh the claims.
Yeah, and there's like a mismatch between the timing. Like you always have this float of money. And so Starbucks they mentioned like that Starbucks would be like one of the top 10 largest banks in the country. If it were categorized as a bank because of all this money that it holds. And so it's like I feel like you'd have to, if you're really going to change the culture and all that things, like you'd have to get rid of or modify in a big way, like the online ordering. You'd have to simplify the menu, and all these things would probably upset some amount of customers, and the easiest way would be to take it private as a company, and then you're like out of the public view, and you could make these changes and kind of like deal with the financial ramifications of almost like getting smaller, getting leaner, and making it I mean at an unimaginable scale.
The buyout would be insane, right? Like how you'd put together an investment group to essentially, how does that work?
Yeah, you'd put together an investment group, and he talks about, I mean, that was another interesting thing he talked about. It was in 2008 that Starbucks almost went bankrupt.
Yeah, they were 7 months from insolvency.
Yeah, and so that would have been right when
happens?
You're public. Yeah, when your public market value is that low, that would be the ideal time to come in and take something private. But see, what's their market cap right now is $112 billion. So you'd have to come in with an investor group that could like finance that plus some kind of premium to take it, to pay out all the shareholders. Right, to buy all the stock and take it private.
So like Elon and Bezos get together and like make a big play for this thing.
Yeah, that would. I don't know what the largest kind of like private, like taking company private transaction would be, but I feel like maybe somewhere in like 25 to 50 billion dollars is maybe the biggest one that's ever happened. So I could totally be wrong there, but it seems like where it is now, it's like that is difficult.
And what happens when they were close to insolvency? What happens if they did go bankrupt? What happens if a public company like that just goes bankrupt?
Totally. I mean, so likely they would have canceled a bunch of so you go into like the bankruptcy process, you file all these documents of like your assets, liabilities, what your company looks like, and it's an opportunity to essentially get out of all of like the underperforming leases. So that's usually what retail companies do when they file for bankruptcy, is like use it as an opportunity to cut out all these like underperforming leases, and they could close stores and get out of leases and things like that, and kind of take the financial hit then, within the form of bankruptcy. And then they'd essentially, if they had debt, essentially those debt holders become the new shareholders in the company, and the company can reemerge.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, because
right.
a lot of like airlines have historically gone through like a bankruptcy process, and they'll file. I think probably every major American airline has filed for bankruptcy in the past, and they like get out of the airline leases. They like get rid of planes that they don't need, and then whoever owns the debt, essentially there's some kind of transaction where the debt holders become the new shareholders of the company.
Are there instances where the amount of debt is greater than the amount of shares available to represent that debt? So for example, a public company has X amount of shareholders.
Yeah.
And then now, if they go bankrupt,
I mean, the shareholders get zero.
They get zero.
Potentially. I mean,
are they replaced, or do they still hold those shares at zero value, or they just get kicked out?
No, it's like if there's not. So this is now we're getting more into kind of like
I'm just curious.
Yeah, reorganization, because this is something I used to actually, part of the area that I used to work in when I did Wall Street work was we would invest in some bankrupt companies, and essentially the company. So there's like a shareholder representative and there's like a creditor representative, and the shareholder representative would have to prove that there's enough value in the company that's worth more than all of the debt, so that for there to be anything worth like left over to the current shareholders. But it's a really complex transaction where it's like there have been examples like this mall, like General Growth Properties, they owned like a ton of malls and they went bankrupt. They had like some liquidity issues where they didn't have enough short-term money, but they had all this real estate that was actually worth way more. They owned all this real estate that was worth more than the debt. So the original shareholders, I mean, the stock went to like sub $1 or something, but then a bunch of people came in and bought, like they believed they had that real estate was worth more. All these people bought money like sub $1, and then when it reemerged as a going concern, it's like those people, like the share price started out essentially like it never went to zero. Kind of through the bankruptcy process, it eventually, like, that share price recovered, and the people that bought that stock like sub $1 made a ton of money.
Interesting.
And the debt holders were all made whole, like they all got 100% of their money, because usually what happens if there's not enough value in the business, the shareholders will get wiped out, like the stock will go to zero, and the debt holders say they'll only get like 70% of their original money, but they'll get it in new shares of the company.
Got it. And if you were already a shareholder and the stock didn't go all the way to zero, you would still retain whatever shares you had?
Yeah, if potentially. It's been a while and I'm not an expert at it.
You might almost seems like there's a math mismatch.
Yeah,
or something.
there's like a math equation in there where you would maybe get some percentage, like maybe the shareholders get like 30% of the new company and the debt holders get 70%. And so, if you owned 100 shares, you wouldn't get wiped to zero, but you'd get, and if you had 100 shares, you'd get 30 in the new enterprise. I think that's how it would work.
So that kind of speaks to why once you're public, it's a growth no matter what because if people are investing in your company and that happens, it's like they can get taken for a big old ride. Like they're, what once was worth a lot.
And it's just,
obvious. I'm saying something super obvious, but it's just, yeah.
Yeah, because it was. And like I said, he talked about like there's, but right, that's what it would have been for them, would be to like get rid of unperforming leases and try to get smaller and like right size the business model and then reemerge after bankruptcy. But it seems like they escaped.
Right. And then with Starbucks, you could never do a thing where, say, because probably the shareholders would either all sell and the price would go down, or people would just be so pissed where it's like, hey, we're going to roll all these things back, remain public, your stock value is going to drop exponentially, and that you just couldn't do it like that. I mean, you could.
It's just really rare, I guess, that people feel so convicted to do something like that. Like maybe you could equate it to like what Elon Musk did with Twitter, right? It's like he kind of like took it private at a huge, like Twitter today, you could argue, is worth a lot less than it was before Elon Musk owned it, and part of that is because like they have like way less advertising revenue now because of like what the decisions he's made running the company.
But that's not like them scaling back on their own accord. That's just someone buying the company, right?
It's him making decisions for what he wants the culture of that company to be, and that it being worth less now than it was in the future.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that makes sense because there's an ownership change and then he's making those decisions, but it's highly unlikely that the current leadership in Starbucks would make those decisions on their own, right, without an intervention from outside.
And there's a lot of complexities because then you get in the public markets, you could get huge investment funds that would come in and buy the stock as it plummets. If they made these decisions and the stock got cut in half, then there's all these funds that will come in and buy a big percentage of the stock, and then they can like advocate to put their own leadership, right?
So you could essentially lose your company.
Yeah, you could lose your company, and the people who want to like maximize the profit can come in and buy up all the shares and elect people to the board and put it on the track they want it to go on.
And then you're essentially going to be right back where you started.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, or worse.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, that is super interesting. Some other interesting things about the interview. I love the little cultural quirks. And again, I have so much respect for what this dude has done. It's like, I'm never going to do anything like that. It's incredible to create this global brand. Even though it might not be what he thinks it is, that's totally fine. Like that's cool.
Or the other people.
It's a really impressive feat from someone who came from nothing to like have the energy and the talent to like make this work. So I'm not hating, but there's just all kinds of interesting stories. I love that he doesn't know what third wave coffee is at all.
Totally.
When he's describing what third wave coffee is, he just essentially describes a small boutique business that's a craft roaster, which is not really what third wave coffee is, but I thought it was funny to hear him talk about that. And then he couldn't help but make a dig towards like none of them offer even close to the experience of what we offer in the reserve stores or the roasteries.
Which is, again, what he says versus what they did, because, dude, let's be real, the reserve store openings was to try to like staunch the flow of people leaving Starbucks to go to more third wave cafes, right? That's literally the impetus for like why there are currently reserve stores. And then for him to deny that it like affected them at all. It's like, dude, it obviously did, because you just created a whole new type of store that you didn't have to create.
Well, and you can see even way before that. So when I was working at Ritual in 2006 to 2009, most people were doing batch brewing. Like we were batch brewing French press. So we'd make like hundreds of French presses a day because we did everything like that, like huge French presses. I think Intelligentsia was doing the triple urns a la Pete's, and like most people batch brewed. And then before the pour over pivot, really, we got the Clover machine.
Yeah.
And, you know, there were pour over bars existed for sure. Like Santa Cruz Coffee Roasting had a pour over bar, like
OG.
Like OG. Theoretically, I've heard they're one of the first pour over bars in the US. I don't know if that's actually true. But the Clover came into big popularity. It's, you know, you've probably seen a Clover. It's a vacuum press with a screen and a piston, and you use a squeegee. And we were geeking out on it because you could dial in the temperature of the water and the dwell time, and you had this whisk that you would like use a certain amount of agitation. You save profiles for multiple different coffees inside the machine. So I'm like, cool, I want the Guji like this, and I want Damien's coffee like that, and you just like dial it up and load it, and that just exploded, and it became one of these. If you had some sort of money in third wave coffee and could afford that, you probably bought a Clover machine. I mean, they're probably 10 or 15 grand for like a one group, like, you know, it wasn't cheap. And then Starbucks ends up buying the company. You know, tell me that's not related to seeing like this emerging market trend in specialty coffee and saying, oh yeah, we need to get on this. So it's like, I don't think they're trying to compete with us, but there's some version of, we need to reclaim craft because we're just not a part of this conversation anymore. And people are going to, you know, they're not losing market share to one competitor. They're losing market share to just a whole conglomerate of small independent roasters. And there's, you know, just like they were front runners of this trend in the 80s, like there's a new trend emerging that they're not even a part of. Yeah. And, you know, I think it's interesting that like he doesn't see a little bit of himself and he can't give some sort of cultural nod to where like, I mean, he doesn't say anything disparaging necessarily, but it's more
dismissive.
The more the dig at the end where it's like, none of them have even anything close to, and it's like, what we're trying to do is not what the Reserve Roastery ended up doing anyway. It's like the Reserve spots are impressive. You know, it's like when I go to Seattle and I go in there, I'm like, this is an impressive operation in terms of you got pneumatics moving beans around overhead. You've got augers that are automatically topping off hoppers that, you know, you don't have to open a bag and dump in the coffee. It like goes from a bin. And he describes it in the podcast as this, you know, I got my group of friends together and we watched Willy Wonka and said, how do we do this in real life? And I think that's cool because nothing else like it exists, but it also doesn't feel natural, authentic, or real to me. It just kind of feels like, I don't know. It doesn't, I don't know.
Like more just like for show.
It's more for show. And I don't think there's anything wrong with a show, but it doesn't.
I just want people to tell me it, like be honest that like they wanted a show. Right, like don't try to tell me it's something else.
Well, but I'm kind of torn on this, and it's why it's hard for me to describe because we also want to put on a show.
Right, but we talk about it as part of the culture and as part of the experience that we're trying to offer.
I think it's maybe when you have something that you're missing out on, but you're not a part of the thing that you're missing out on. And you feel like you need to be a part of it. So you make this thing that's like, we're going to outdo it by 10x, but it still doesn't speak to the core of what they're missing out on. You know what I mean? If I went to, like what's a good parallel? I mean, the things that these smaller independent craft third wave coffee companies have to offer is not this fantastical Willy Wonka thing. It's more about care, consideration,
human connection,
communication, human connection. And no matter how much you dress up one thing, just because you have something roasted on site and it is an incredible visual feat, it doesn't mean it has those other things. And it doesn't mean it necessarily feels real. Yeah. So while I enjoy it for what it is, I don't think I would ever make that my day-to-day coffee shop.
Right.
Because we don't experience coffee in terms of this weird fanfare, like
Tourist attraction.
Exactly. We experience it every day, and it feels intimate. And he talks about that. That's what's interesting.
He talks about a lot of things.
Well, because at the end of the podcast, he's talking about how what they can't do is be seen through this lens of thousands of stores. They can't be seen, like, he talks about ubiquity being their enemy, that they need to resonate on a individual store level, and every store has to have that connective, inspiring feeling. And I don't think he's wrong. It's just not.
That's just not what they've created.
It's not what they've created. Correct.
Right, and that again is like the whole. That's just like one of the interesting takeaways for me is just, again, what he keeps saying is one thing, but what they keep doing are all of these things, all the decisions that they're actually making are decisions in favor of scale, in favor of more revenue, in favor of efficiency, like all these complexity, all these things, like ubiquity, in favor of ubiquity, in favor of complexity. Like these are all the decisions being made. So it's like, again, that's just the interesting part of the episode is that he can tell these great stories that are very wistful and like, sound emotionally true. But in reality, the choices that the company made have all been choices that are the complete opposite of the idealistic story that he keeps talking about, which is just unfortunate because, like you said, he's like, again, hey, he's built a huge, quote unquote, successful company. But man, I just want, like, things that are really important to me is like, I want to believe the person. Like, I want to believe people for like the visions they have, especially people that have big visions. I want to believe them. And it's like when he just keeps talking about these visions and these stories and this idyllic thing, but the reality is that the stores are essentially like McDonald's serving coffee. It's just, I just don't believe you anymore. And that's like, I think that is a huge failure. Like on his part.
Do you think it's? Do you think it's intentional? Like, do you think he believes it yet continues to do things that are not aligned with that belief? Like, do you think it's a complete act, or do you think there is some sort of internal tension? Like, do you think he's just an amazing front man? Because where it's like,
because we've met people like that before who like
absolutely
will lie right to our faces.
Right? Do you think he's lying? Because the impression that I get is that he's not, but he's got. You know how sometimes people have a really hard time seeing their own demons and wrestling with their own truths and admitting like when they're just messing something up or not acting in ways that are resonating with their highest values. Like that's kind of what it feels like to me. That like there is a little bit of dishonesty when it's like if he was saying like first and foremost, I want to grow a big company. I want to grow a nationwide recognized brand that people are going to remember forever, that's going to be woven into the fabric of American culture and ultimately the world. That is my goal. And we're going to do it by starting off with this, quality and culture first framework and then go from there. That seems like what he's doing. Like that's how I read his intention. He's painting it the other way around though. He's painting it of we never wanted to be a big brand.
Yeah,
like we were never trying to create a thing. So, and I'm just like struggling with, is he lying or is he just confused in the way that it's easy to get confused when you're not fully self-aware because you can't see your own blind spots. But he's so smart though. He's like, I know I'm just having a conversation by myself, but I'm wondering all these things as I'm listening.
That's why I'm so curious for other people to listen to the interview and see what they think about it.
Because
I mean, again, we talked about it when me and you were just talking about the episode. Like, it seems like he may have started with those ideas being closer to reality, but like that that he had levels of priority, right? And it seems like at every decision, while he had this like idealistic idea, the bigger priority for whatever reason for him was the decision that led to scale, efficiency, and ubiquity.
Right.
And that, like, you know, maybe in the beginning you don't see how you're, like, again, it being boiled a little bit at a time, but it's like at every turn, like, every decision that they've made since he bought the company, he has these ideals, but the priority, it's like, it just, again, people's actions show me what, like, who they are. And it
Yeah.
just seemed like his priority was always growth and scale, and the ideals got a backseat to that.
We'll end with this because Jared just showed up. So the aside from the cool stories, which the stories are great, and I really wish I could have been a fly on the wall for a lot of these conversations, and I'm a big history buff, so going back to the inception of these things would be really interesting. It was a good reminder for me to understand what you want out of whether it's your life or your business or your projects, and to keep those ideals first and foremost, because it's really, really easy to compromise them for short-term gain, whether that's monetary, whether that's status, whether it's social, whatever it is, because the way that the episode ended was really funny. And this is where this is why I'm struggling with, like, what does he actually believe? I mean, again, like you're saying, the actions speak louder than words. So, but he seems kind of bummed.
Yeah.
He seems pretty bummed. And then the thing that drove it home for me is, like, he's bummed, and he talks about not being able to get away from it. Because imagine if you created a company and you were bummed out about how it goes, like, the experience isn't living up to what you want it to be, and there's one on every corner in every city ever. It would be like if I hated Cat and Cloud, but I couldn't get away from it. You know what I mean? It's like every airport he goes to, like every street he walks down, Starbucks, 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 Starbucks. I made this. I don't like it. What the fuck is going on? Like, that's crazy. Like, can you imagine how that feels? That's wild.
Yeah, and it just seems like, one of the things I took away was like you said, it's like, and even if we're gonna, believe the best intentions about people and that how he started it, it just seems like at some point it got away from him, and that it got too big for him to control, and it got too big for the ideals that he talked about to be realistic. Like, it just seems like, and that probably, I think when you talk about like him being bummed at the episode, it's like, it just seems like he had this vision for something, and it has just gotten so far away from him that he can't even grasp it anymore.
Yeah, because I do pick up the tension. It's just like, I don't get the sense that he's writing these letters to the board, like these open letters to the board and to the employees on LinkedIn, as a call for attention or anything like that. Like, it seems like he cares about something, even though he, like, again, I said, like, he put them on that path years ago, but it seems like there's some part of him that's bummed about it.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think if we just think about like human nature, he's probably in his 70s, 80s right now, and it's like there could be, you're in a different mind space of like being 70 or 80 and looking back at what you've built has become, versus being inside of it, and like pushing for, like, again, your priority of like, the status and all this stuff of being a CEO of like a Fortune 500 company. It's like being inside of it probably feels one way, and then being on the outside and being old and kind of remembering what it was like when you first started something, and reflecting on those ideals you had at the beginning, and then seeing what it's become, I mean, I imagine that would be really hard for anyone.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Sounds like a good place to end. Thanks for listening to the podcast, y'all. We appreciate it. Every once in a while, I'll get people coming up to me in person saying they listen to it, and that
Super
always
cool.
makes me feel good. Appreciate that you're out there crushing it. We'll see you next
Thanks,
time.
everybody.
Hey everyone, that's the podcast for the week. Thanks so much for listening. If you heard something that inspired you, let us know, or tell a friend. These are the types of connections that are the most important to us and that we seek to create every day. If there's something you heard and you want to know more about, send us an email to podcast@catandcloud.com or head to our website, catandcloud.com/podcast, and let us know. While you're on our site, check out everything we have to offer. Dive deep into one of our single origin coffees or pick up a little treat for yourself. We have something for everyone, so check it out. Also, find us in the usual places, YouTube, Instagram. We're always there sharing amazing things. All right, that's it. Thanks everyone for being awesome. We'll be back next week.